Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm speaking to you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present and the Aboriginal leaders of other communities who may be here today. Well, 6 Weeks, 6 Issues is our weekly talk series where we're exploring the big issues we're facing as COVID-19 changes the world around us. And we're bringing you the top policy experts and decision makers to answer your questions. And today we're looking at the future of the economy. Some of you have already sent questions in online, but you can also submit questions today during the event through Slido, and you can vote for questions to help me with moderation. I'd like to introduce now our guests. Michael Brennan, Chair of the Productivity Commission. Michael previously was a Deputy Secretary in both the Federal Treasury and the Victorian Department of Treasury and Finance. And he has also worked as an Associate Director in the Economics and Policy Practice of PricewaterhouseCoopers and as a Senior Advisor to Treasurers and to Ministers of Finance at both the state and federal levels. Melinda Cilento is CEO of CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, as well as a non-executive director of Australian Unity and co-chair of Reconciliation Australia. Melinda is also a member of the Parliamentary Budget Office panel of expert advisors. She was previously a non-executive director of Woodside Petroleum and a commissioner with the Productivity Commission and deputy CEO and chief economist with the Business Council of Australia. And George Megalogenis is an author, journalist with more than 3 decades experience in the media, including 11 years in the Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery. He is the author of 5 books, including The Australian Moment, which formed the basis of his 3-part ABC documentary series, Making Australia Great. George also wrote and presented the ABC documentary on former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser. A warm welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us. Michael, we'll start with you. Give us a sense of your assessment of the impact of the pandemic on the Victorian economy and the national economy.
So clearly it's going to have a very significant short-term impact by virtue of the restrictions that effectively closed down businesses in the affected sectors. And to the extent the Victorian economy is 25% of the national economy, the recovery to some extent will be impacted or slowed by the extent of the additional Victorian restrictions and their longevity. The question throughout, I think, this pandemic has always been how quickly the economy would recover. And I think all of us have come on a bit of a journey in that respect, that early on there was a bit of a sense that we would see, albeit a sharp, but a relatively V-shaped recovery, that we'd see a dramatic reduction early on as the economy was shut down, and then we would return to, and although this might sound naive in retrospect, probably a world not unlike what we had in February 2020. And I think bit by bit, and particularly with the continuation of Victorian restrictions, I think more and more the penny is dropping that this could be a longer period, a longer, slower recovery, and potentially with many bumps along the way. So as to where we'll be in 12, 18 months down the track, I think it's very hard to say. And when the Treasury and the Reserve Bank have looked at this and put some forecasts around it, they themselves have had to concede that those are things around which there's a pretty significant variance of potential outcomes.
Melinda, what's your take on that?
I think I agree with a lot of what Michael said. I think a couple of points that I'd sort of add to it. I think even in the early days when everyone was talking about this V-shaped recovery, where we got to at the end of 2021, we were still at a level of activity that was below where we were at the end of 2019. So even with that V-shape, that's, it's kind of like the missing 2 years, if you like, with higher unemployment, big challenges going forward. If you look at the fiscal update forecast, which of course are now out of date because of what's happened in Victoria, even sitting within those are even some really big challenges for us economically. That forecast includes a fall in non-mining business investment of around 20%. And that's on the back of a long-term trend where we've been looking at how we reignite and re-energise business investment. So I think there's some really significant challenges that this crisis has brought to the fore. And then the final point, just to highlight, everyone's focused on Victoria. Yes, we're 25% of the economy. I was talking to someone who was reminding me that the Port of Melbourne is the busiest container port in all of Australia. And through that port comes things like cars, which would go to an economy like WA, which is picking up. And so there are sort of flow-on effects here that are going to be bigger and broader than just that 25% of the economy.
That's a really good point, and George, I might come to you on that. I mean, the interdependencies, you know, what's happening in Victoria isn't standalone. What do you think will be the ramifications on the broader recovery?
Take 25, and I think as both Michael and Melinda allude, take 25% of the economy out, shut it down completely, because the second lockdown, which is now we're at stage 4 with an 8 p.m. curfew, we're pretty much shutting Victoria down and only allowing the essential services that are working at the moment are the health system, but the health system dedicated to a single task, which is to deal with COVID, and basically a couple of industries that feed people and move essential workers around. That's basically all that's running in the economy at the moment. So 80 to 90% of Victoria is closed. That's close to 22% of the national economy shut down overnight. And because it's the second lockdown, the confidence effect has a multiplier, I think, that runs through the rest of the country. Now, maybe just take half a step back and think about what it is we're trying to do living with this virus. We're trying to run a nation state with 6 states and 2 territories, isolated from the rest of the world and removed from the thing that had underwritten our growth for the last 10 years, which was overseas migration. So overseas migration is not just migrants landing in Australia and spreading out all through the labour markets of the 6 territories, and the 6 states and 2 territories, but also international students, which was the 3rd or 4th largest, depending on which day you measure it, 3rd or 4th largest export for the country. So we're trying now in this environment to try and grow within the context of a nation closed off from the rest of the world. Now, in the past, we couldn't have a recession unless the rest of the world had a recession. We can't have a recovery in Australia unless the rest of the world fixes this problem. And it can't fix this problem while the virus is burning around the rest of the country and the rest of the world at different rates. And that's the unknowable now for us in the next 2 years. If the world can settle down, we could probably settle down a lot quicker.
Michael, what's your response to that? I mean, it's interesting to think and perhaps to examine the bust cycle, previous bust cycles. Are there things that we can learn, or is this something quite different?
I suspect it is quite different. I mean, part of the challenge for Australia is we haven't endured a recession for over 30 or 28 years. And when we look back to past recessions, such as that in the early 1990s and obviously that in the 1930s, one of the conclusions that you would draw, to the extent one can draw common threads, is the economy. One thing that tends to lag is the labour market. So the economy will tend to improve or recover in terms of GDP per capita quicker than unemployment will return to its pre-crisis peak. Now, I think it remains to be seen whether that's true these days, because over the course of the past 30 years, we've tended to observe that the labour market is, if anything, a fair bit more flexible than was the case in the early 1990s. In the early 1990s recession, we saw a very, very significant shedding of labour. We went through a kind of a mini slowdown at the time of the global financial crisis, but if anything, most firms kind of cut back on hours worked and people went to 4-day weeks and that sort of thing. So there was a fair bit of flexibility in the economy. We're obviously seeing significant either shedding of labour or people kind of at the moment sort of warehoused under the JobKeeper scheme, working very few hours. We will see how quickly the labour market can return when the economy returns. But one lesson you would draw from the past is the labour market can be a bit stubborn and slow in its recovery. We've also released some research just recently that said even in the period prior, from the GFC up to 2018, young people in particular kind of experienced the slowness of the labour market more acutely than others in terms of flat income growth. So there can be an element of scarring that occurs if you're just one of that unlucky cohort that comes into the labour market at a time when labour demand is particularly soft. So there's some of the things we're going to have to be pretty focused on, I think, in the recovery and beyond.
Hey, can I just jump in there too? I think, one of the things that people are talking about and that we just don't have a handle on really is that this is really the first services sector recession. So normally you get other parts of the economy that they collapse really sharply And in fact, services are sort of the thing that keeps us a bit level, if you like. And so this is a really different sort of recession to the ones that we've seen in the past. And people are really trying to grapple with this. And so, to Michael's point, I think, there's views around the labour market, particularly when we thought it would be shorter, that services sectors these services businesses are the ones that have higher voluntary sort of turnover all the time. So maybe this means that we'll get a faster bounce back in employment. The other thing that I was talking to someone about in the US last night is that for most economists, you think of recessions as a period of sort of creative destruction, right? That's that the least productive firms fail, and that what you get at the other side is a bit of a productivity lift because the best businesses have survived. This time around, it feels like actually survival doesn't really depend on whether you're a better or worse restaurant. It just depends on luck. And do you have access to capital, and do you have access to JobKeeper support or not? And so, there's some really different dynamics and complexions to this from anything else that we've seen in the past. Finally, before you even start talking about global economic uncertainty and political uncertainty and the momentum behind globalisation and what we think about that.
It's really interesting points. George, you're a great student of history. Do you agree that this is quite a different scenario?
Yes, it's different. So there are two scenarios from the past that are actually working in tandem, but not to anyone's. It doesn't make explaining this one any easier. It's just these are the two epic chapters in the past that I've sort of put together in my head. It clearly is a depression-like experience because large sections of the economy are just closed off. Now, the depression, of course, unemployment peaks at 30%. We're not going to get to 30%, but 1 in 3 workers have been reduced to practically 0 hours anyway. So lockdown has a depression-like effect in the short term on people's ability to work. But the other part to it is, and this is the bit where the shutdown starts to look like something else, which is the command economy we had during the Second World War, which is only essential industries remain open and everything else is pretty much shut down in service of the war effort. But during the Second World War, we had virtually full employment. So we've got a command economy. We've got a command economy running to deal with the health crisis. Because remember, this isn't an economic shock. This is a health shock that creates an economic shock. The second part to it is we've got depression-like situation in the labour market. So there is no rule book for dealing with it. But they're the two things you always have to balance in your head. The government is now in control of the economy in a way that it hasn't been in control outside of the war, but without quite the same upside that it had to put everyone to good use. Because in a sense, what it's doing is standing down most of the workforce to fight the virus. So they're the complications for them. The complications are, even if you get this thing done right, you have to let a lot of people go. Lock them down, keep them in the house to knock the infection rate down.
It's really interesting too, though, isn't it, to think about how differently Australians are living their lives right now. So in Victoria here, we're in lockdown, we're in curfew, etc. And yet on the other side of the country, really life is going on as normal. That's kind of a first for Australia. And how do we start to get an equilibrium around that? Michael, I might go to you first.
Well, I think it's a very good question. I mean, as I was saying to you earlier, I'm in Canberra at the moment, right? I'm anomalous because I'm a Canberra-based chair of an organisation that's predominantly Melbourne-based. Most of our people are in Melbourne, and we've obviously shut the Melbourne office. And I think it's noticeable the difference, not so much the difference in mindset. I mean, I think that there is a fair degree of sort of solidarity with the experience of Victorians and a bit of nervousness around the rest of the country that restrictions could come back at any point if the pandemic were to take root and get out of control in other states. What I'd observe, though, is that, it's those first few incremental liftings of restrictions that basically allow life to return to a degree of normality. You don't, for a lot of people, they don't need the big crowds or, going to rock concerts and that sort of thing. It's just that those abilities to catch up with a couple of people, maybe go to a cafe and sit in a socially distanced way, that generates a significant amount of benefit for individuals. But I think, it's at the moment there's quite a distinction between the everyday lifestyle here in Canberra and what's going on in Melbourne.
Michael, sorry. Yeah, could I just throw a question back to Michael? Michael, does it remind you of a mining boom without a mining boom? Because WA and Queensland seem to be doing better than everybody else. The southern states, for various reasons, are in trouble. But the second part to it, and Kate, you mentioned earlier history, the elephant in the room is Melbourne. So Melbourne, in pretty much, for different reasons, pretty much every recession had the hardest landing. Certainly had in the early 90s. Unemployment rate here went up to 13%, where nationally it sort of was 10s and 11s, depending on whether you're a man or a woman. 11 if you're a bloke, 10 if you're a woman. Melbourne, of course, was the fallout at the end of the 1880s land boom. Land values collapsed by 50% here in the 1890s, and more people left than turned up to this city for the next 10 years. So a bit of history repeating here in terms of the here and now. Why would it happen to us? There might be something in our in the water here that we fly the highest during the booms and have the furthest to fall.
Melinda, what do you think about that?
I think it's really interesting. Let me give you a little anecdote first. I can't resist doing this though, in terms of what it feels like. So, one of the things that we did when we went under lockdown to sort of stay in touch, we've got family in Queensland, and we got in the habit of Saturday late afternoons playing games, virtual games, and we get all the family in, and we'd be on Zoom, and really good attendance, right? Well, now that Queensland's off and running again, like no one wants to play with us. so we've got real physical lockdown, and now we've got virtual lockdown as well. So that's what it feels like. In terms of the Melbourne thing, it's a really interesting point too, and I think we're talking before about the role of immigration. I mean, population growth has been a huge driver of growth in Victoria recently, and you've seen it manifest in all sorts of ways. And again, I pull out some numbers. The Treasurer's fiscal update included a number that he called out, 0.6% population growth for the country next year, which is the lowest since 1916, talk about going back to history. So there are some real challenges for Victoria around, what is going to be the driver of growth, what is the structure of economic activity here, and how do we sort of reignite, a more sort of dynamic economy. But I think one of the things I've been talking to my research team about is whether we need to start thinking a little bit more, looking at the European experience, where you've got 2 or 3 speed economies and one monetary policy, and thinking about what that means from a policy setting. And depending on how long it goes in Victoria, the fiscal burden in Victoria is going to be significant. Yet, as a state, we will still have many of the financial and fiscal challenges associated with population ageing. And so how is that going to manifest itself? And you can think about GST debates. And so I think there is actually a really interesting policy question here, which is just about macroeconomic stability, and the rules of the game going forward there as well. And so I'd be interested in whether Michael or George have any sort of thoughts on that.
Well, I think that is a good question. It goes a bit to George's question about when the last time we saw a significant 2-speed economy sort of open up was at the peak of the mining boom. So if you think about around 2011-12, the dollar went through parity with the United States dollar. The dollar was running at 110 cents US, which was a disaster for the manufacturing industry, pretty disastrous for the tourism industry, anything that's kind of dollar sensitive or relies for its competitiveness on the value of the dollar. And you're right, in Victoria, and to an extent also in Tasmania, even to some extent in New South Wales, certainly South Australia, there was a sense of not quite recession-like conditions, but nearly that, and a bit of a sense of flatness. Probably the 2 things that mitigated that, I think, were one, that there was a lot of nimbleness and flexibility about the way the Victorian economy effectively reoriented. And you had the professional services firms and financial sector kind of gearing themselves more towards mining because it's where the action was, engineering services and the like. So a lot of that knowledge economy in Melbourne was effectively just shifting towards where there was demand. The other thing was that the rise in the dollar, whilst it was bad for a bunch of industries, also has a significant wealth effect for Victorians in general, right? So people could travel, people buy things cheaply, etc., and that creates a sense of buoyancy. This time is very different, very difficult at the moment, right now, to find a silver lining for Victoria. There's not really the capacity to reorient and do other things. It just is what it is for the time being. And I think, to Melinda's point, the question is now, will we see coming out of this a more stark and prolonged divergence of economic fortunes, in which case, because we haven't had that in Australia for much really in the past. I mean, Australia's federation, for the most part, we've had a fair bit of homogeneity of economic fortune, with those, allowing for a bit of cycle. And I think it would be if we became more like the United States or more like Europe, where you do have the single monetary policy, multiple fiscal policies, but bigger disparities between regions, then it is a whole new policy challenge.
George, I might come to you in a moment. Just a reminder to our audience that you can submit questions. We'll be coming to your questions in a moment. George, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was having a flashback to the late 80s, early 90s, and certainly by the time the recession was underway nationally, and it was clear in Victoria that the landing was harder than anywhere else. There was I remember Treasury officers and even people at the Reserve Bank were wistfully wondering whether they could have two interest rate policies, relatively tight monetary policy for New South Wales and Queensland, which had soft landings, and drastic cuts in interest rates in Victoria. That debate, it wasn't a live debate. It was more joking in the corridors. But there was a recognition then that the landing in Victoria was so much harder than everywhere else that sort of national policy couldn't put a cushion under Victoria without actually setting off some bad consequences everywhere else. The difficulty we have right this minute, the rest of the country is now piling on Dan Andrews and the Victorian government. The difficulty the rest of the country has, whilst they sort of, are torn between sort of personal sympathy but political payback, is that the state is going to, because it's 25% of the national economy, the state is going to need an intervention, not just in terms of JobKeeper, but in terms of how governments pick and choose the projects that you can get going within a lockdown context, infrastructure and the like. And also, remember, this is the leading state. We're in the leading state for the international student market. Sooner or later, we're going to have to figure out how to get students back into the country, quarantine them for 14 days before you release them onto campus, or unfortunately for some, straight into lockdown. So those decisions need to be made sensitive to the fact that if you want to punish Victoria for having let the virus run free, you actually destroy the country. So you almost have to overcompensate for Victoria's mistake to make sure that Victoria keeps up with everywhere else. And as I say, looking at history, and this is the echo for me that's concerning me, I can pick you 2 or 3 examples in the past where this city and this state is where all the downside was. And of course, you think about the big Melbourne-Sydney debate, up until the sort of close of business in 2019, Melbourne was on track to be larger than Sydney by 2026. That doesn't look like that is going to happen anytime soon now. But you still want Melbourne, as your second city, to be the second most viable place in the country, not a basket case.
Melinda, would you agree with that? Do you think that we're no longer on track as we were to, to meet that kind of target? And also, I suppose I'm interested in your views in relation to how quickly, if ever, can the international education sector recover in Victoria?
Well, firstly, I'm just going to make the observation that George is assuming that New South Wales, fingers crossed, continues to skate through this without having to to end up where Victoria is, which in all honesty, I really hope they do. I mean, I just think it would be terrible if this ends up being what's happening elsewhere, and all of us who've been under lockdown 3.0, 4.0 know that the second, third and fourth time just feels so much harder. In terms of international students, I think we need to be really serious about this. It's a really important driver, not just of our education sector, but actually also tourism. And if you go down to Tassie and talk to anyone in Tassie, the rejuvenation of their economy based around international students, parents who are coming to visit those students, and what that contributed to the economy, and the way that that then enabled them to look at alternative drivers of economic activity, including arts and culture, has been phenomenal. And so to think that there aren't broader sort of tentacles through so many aspects of our economic prosperity, I think is really short-sighted. So getting our heads around that and figuring out what we can do and how we can get students back, I just think is absolutely critical. And I mean, it sits alongside of the broader migration conversation. And I know, when unemployment is high, there is, much more questioning about, levels of immigration. Absolutely appropriate, but you're already hearing conversations in WA about how we're going to get the skills we need. What does that look like? We can't shut ourselves off. And so there is a broader conversation here around movement of people and getting across that. Just one final point, Kate, we can take this up later if you like. I just think the big question for us, whether it's Victoria or the rest of the country, is how, this language around economic dynamism, how do we create more energy and vibrancy in our economy and the whole movement of people across sectors across borders? At some point, we've got to get our focus on that and thinking about where the opportunities for domestically energized growth are in the future, as well as just absolute world-class leading, businesses. That's how we have to be framing our thinking here in Victoria and elsewhere.
Terrific points. Michael, your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree that dynamism will ultimately be the key. That one of the challenges clearly for businesses coming out of this will be that they have had, we've had a period where the sort of temporary supports put in place, which have got a very strong policy case in a macroeconomic sense. JobKeeper, the interest payment deferral, to some extent the commercial rent deferral, which a lot of businesses have benefited from. They come to an end, and there is then the risk that there's a kind of a reckoning for a number of businesses. And it's interesting to ponder, the rates of business entry and exit into the economy in any year. We in a normal year, we have something like 300,000 new businesses forming in Australia, and something similar exiting. Most firms that exit don't exit through failure; they exit for other reasons. At the moment, we have 900,000 firms on JobKeeper. That'll probably be expanded with the augmentation that's been announced today in respect to Victoria. So that gives you a sense of, what the potential need on the creation side of the ledger will be if some of those firms currently benefiting from JobKeeper ultimately don't make it, and if they kind of see the cascading effect of the withdrawal over time of those temporary supports as just too much. So that's one concern. I think the other concern is, ironically, not so much in respect of the firms that don't make it, but some of the firms that do survive, whether they survive in a form and in a state where they're prepared to take a risk, borrow money, make an investment, employ people, try out a new business model. So in a general sense, I think it's very important that our policy settings reflect the need to encourage that dynamism, reflect the need to encourage a bit of entrepreneurship. Remembering entrepreneurship is itself a scarce commodity, like coal or iron ore. You have a certain amount in any society. Not everybody's prepared to take a punt on forming a business, mortgage the house to go into business, etc. So you do have to nurture it a bit and encourage it. And so we will need policies that are very focused on increasing the flexibility of the economy to the extent we can, making it as easy as possible for new businesses to enter, nurturing them through a bit, reducing the regulatory burden to the extent that's absolutely required to achieve the social goals that regulation tries to bring about. So I agree. I think that the dynamic bounce back will be, and the strength of it will be, a key determinant of our success.
Look, we've got some great questions coming through from our audience. And George, this first one is just flows from a comment that you made. What do you expect to be the effect on the economy of the substantial reduction in immigration and the tightening of foreign investment controls?
So I can't speak so much about foreign investment because I think the globe itself is self-isolating. Each country is self-isolating from one another, and most of the investment is going to be very domestically focused. But in terms of immigration, the equation in Australia is pretty straightforward. When we were running that massive demand-driven migration program over the course of the last decade, it was the thing that was keeping the economy growing. After the mining cycle had ended, after the productivity cycle from the 90s, from the 80s and 90s reform had ended, this was the thing that was keeping us going. But over and above the economy, what it was doing was slowing the ageing process in Australia. Because the bulk of the Chinese and the Indian migration, especially, was in that age group, in that late teens through the mid 30s, so students and prime working age. So you cut yourself off from that, and remember our birth rate has been below replacement rate since about 1976. You cut yourself off from that, even for a couple of years, what you get is an accelerator of ageing in Australia. There are a couple of parts of Australia that are already in a situation today where there are more people aged 65 and over than under 15. Tasmania is one of them, and Adelaide's just about to click over. We'll be the first mainland capital that's in that position. Go 2 years without a large migration program, and you get basically 2/3 of the country clicks over to that point. Now, this is a demographic challenge that's been coming for 40 years, but we've sort of been holding off with migration. And for the life of me, I can't think how a country survives without it, even for a year or two. Which is why I think most of the sort of political stresses will be sort of driving government to figure out a way to open up safely to the rest of the world, even whilst the rest of the world is still infected, for want of a better term. So that's the. I see nothing but downside if the longer we keep our borders closed. But I also see our survival instinct at some point kicking in, where we probably have to manage a way to reopen again. Now, that's not just in international students, it's also, if you think about the agriculture sectors, going to need to figure out a way to bring in temporary workers. And there'll be sectors of the economy that will need skills. The other part to it is, think about what a pandemic does to your job mix. It actually raises the premium for labour in the healthcare and aged care sector. Now, obviously, we haven't talked much about aged care, but this has been a disaster. And sort of going forward, without getting into too many management cliches here, governments, plural, in cooperation with the private sector, are going to have to figure out a way to bring in a workforce into the aged care sector, especially, that is well paid, well skilled, highly skilled, and is going to reduce the risk of people just dropping off every time the virus comes back. So there's a number of challenges. Most of the answers to these questions can't be found in the domestic labour force. There just aren't enough people in the domestic labour force to be able to answer all these questions. So I think we'll be opening up sooner or later because we have to.
Fascinating stats on those demographics. A question, Melinda, perhaps for you. It just goes to the heart of the economic impacts on young Australians. The audience member says existing policies seem to benefit those with capital. How will recovery impact the generation who have lost the most opportunities? And a follow-up question, which sectors of the economy are likely to recover fastest? Just if you can answer those simple questions.
Yeah, right, thanks. Look, the point about, and Michael talked to this a little bit earlier about the great work the Productivity Commission did and released recently around what's been happening to incomes for young people. And I think this demographic question, and people have already coined the phrase that the pink recession, because of the disproportionate impact of job losses on women and young people, particularly in the first wave around hospitality and retail. That's a different complexion, right? And there's a couple of things that come from that. And I think the impacts on young people is really significant. And sitting beneath this is I think quite an interesting challenge and conversation around the intergenerational compact. It goes to all the issues that George was talking about in terms of ageing population. And there is now a sense, and I was actually on a call earlier this week with a young woman from Think Forward, which is a younger focused think tank, if I can put it that way. And my sense from listening to her is that the younger generation thinks that intergenerational compact has broken down, and that they're going to carry the can for all these costs that sit with a group of people who've actually done really, really well. They're wealthy, but the system is structured to support their ongoing wealth. And she was really railing against the whole franking credit debate in the last election, and just to kind of visually engage us, was talking about these photographs of these angry grey-haired men sort of bemoaning the loss of their franking credit income, and she's like, where is the compact that existed in past generations, where younger generations thought that the government and older people were sort of thinking about the future in a way that generated opportunity and prosperity, not just right here, right now, but long term. And the sense was that that's gone. And I think that is really a startling challenge for us. And I think we need to take it really seriously. And I think this whole issue around, there's been a lot of talk about income inequality. Again, the Productivity Commission did some great work on this, which, sort of, I think, put the facts on the table. But the wealth inequality is something that we need to be seriously thinking about, in my view, and really asking ourselves, and this, for all the conversation about tax reform and corporate tax rates, to my mind, the fundamental question is, have we got a system that's supporting investment in productive assets and the generation of future income and opportunity? Which sectors are going to recover fastest? Well, that's a really interesting question. It's always a question too, because you might get a sense that some are growing really quickly, but it's because they're growing from devastation. So it might feel like the hospitality and retail sector goes gangbusters for a while, but where they're going to level off and what the future growth prospects are there, I don't know. I'm hopeful that one of the things we can focus on in the positive camp is the entrepreneurship we've seen in the digitisation, which has transformed this economy far faster than we thought. The real continuation of opportunities like telehealth and how we can expand and grow those. And, I can put my Productivity Commission hat back on. When I was there, I worked with the previous chairman on the data access work. There is a tremendous opportunity if we can get the right policy structures and frameworks around better access and use of data that could underpin a wealth of opportunities for Australian businesses that take them globally.
Fantastic. Look, I might go to you, Michael, first on the element and issue of wealth inequality. What are your thoughts on that? A really interesting example given there, Melinda.
Yeah, so I agree that thinking hard about the distributional implications of this downturn are going to be very significant. I mean, in the early 1990s, we probably thought a bit about the distributional implications, but they were a little different. They really tended to be more focused on the sort of contemporaneous long-term reduction in manufacturing jobs, and that was tending to affect, the most concern was really about sort of males in their 50s who never worked again, and some females, particularly in TCF. This is different. So this is much more about young people. I agree with Melinda that at this point, when you survey the field, you would have to say that labour has borne more of the burden than capital, in the sense that, and by that I don't mean the capital invested by small business owners, obviously in their businesses, but homeowners and shareholders to this point have not yet borne the sort of pain that several people in the labour market have. I think on the young people, it's an interesting thing, because to go back a step, when we often think about distributional issues, there's sometimes a dilemma between whether we see people as individuals or whether we see people as members of households. So a lot of the time when we're thinking about inequality, and our work on inequality very much focused on households. So you could be a low income earner, but if you're in a higher income household, we're perhaps a bit less worried about you. And the Melbourne Institute had some interesting data on this when they looked at the sectors that are most affected by the pandemic, i.e. hospitality, aviation and the like, and looked firstly at first blush, who are the workers that are most affected by that? And it's all the things you expect. They're very young, they are predominantly female, etc. Socioeconomically, that was pretty balanced, that they would kind of come from households of all types. But when you remove that lens and you say, okay, now let's think about households where the primary breadwinner is working in one of those sectors, you get a smaller cohort, right? Because a large proportion of these others were kids who were living at home. But when you looked at the ones who were, where the primary breadwinner was in one of these sectors, then of course you find a lot of the traditional stories of disadvantage. The people who are more likely to be in poor health, more likely to suffer poor mental health, much lower superannuation balances, much lower precautionary savings, more likely to live in socioeconomically disadvantaged regions, etc. So often applying that household lens is very important. That said, the individual is also important, because even if you are notionally from a higher socioeconomic background and maybe you are a kid living at home, but you've lost your job in the hospitality industry, I think we do still worry a bit about the potential for longer term labour market scarring. If you're unlucky enough to come into the labour market at a bad time, it's not to say you're the die is cast or anything, but I think we just have to be focused on it from a policy point of view to make sure that that's not the case.
The next question is one, maybe I'll start with you, George, and we might go around the panel, but what can we learn not just from Europeans with the geographic proximity to one another, but from developed economies in our region, Japan and Taiwan?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So Japan, probably not so much now, because Japan is is, in terms of ageing, 10 years ahead of where Australia is. So if you look at a place like Adelaide, just add 10 years to the story for most Japanese cities. There are more people aged 75 and over than under 15. That's just on the age front. But in terms of how they've managed the pandemic, and this is something I think that policymakers in Australia are going to have to wrap their heads around. We're an Asian nation, so we're more likely not to be in front line of the next one. So Taiwan's response, Japan's to an extent, South Korea's response, they are the ones that are going to inform our health response in the future. And once we start thinking that way, and we've already got, you know, world-class health system, and we're one of the sort of, you know, European, if I can put that in inverted commas, nations that's done all right in terms of our pandemic response. Once you get to that next level of thinking, which is, you know, you have to organise your society in a way during lockdown that you test everybody, you clear the field so the hospital system can deal with the most critical cases. You're able to protect your ageing population. All those things require a slightly different way of thinking for Australia. I think we're adaptable in terms of our mixed economy, in terms of sort of government regulation, government intervention, and letting the private sector in. I think we're adaptable enough to figure out how to do it, but it will look different to what we've had up until this point. So we will look more Asian in the way we organise that part of our economy. The other side to it is, what example? So Taiwan's the one you want to have a good look at, because Taiwan's also got, we're not talking much about security at the moment, but Taiwan's also got a relationship with China that we're going to have to figure out. We obviously don't have the same problem the Taiwanese have. The Chinese sooner or later will gobble them up. But we do have, coming out of this pandemic, a sort of international relations and regional diplomatic and security architecture that's been thrown up in the air. So, I mean, I've almost started a different conversation there, but they're the two thoughts I'd have on that question.
Melinda?
I'm going to come at this from a slightly different perspective, which is that I think one of the really fascinating things is going to be, in 5 years' time, maybe we'll have an answer about who did this best, right? Because, I mean, let's be honest, we're all making it up at the moment, really. And, you know, and from my perspective, when people look at one example or another, they tend to be doing it from a values perspective and like from the perspective of having a view about what they think is the best approach, and then grabbing data that supports that. And at the moment, we've just got point-in-time data, and it's just evolving. So just in terms of who did it best, I think we've got no idea, and I think maybe in 5 years' time we will. And there's still, even then, there's all this causality. You know, I know there's a whole bunch of really serious issues and genuine issues that we should be looking at and thinking about, mental health and suicide rates, but the complexity in this is so tremendous. I mean, how do we know what's impacting mental health? Is it lockdown or is it fear of the virus? I mean, there's unpacking this is going to be really difficult. Now, I'm slightly long-winded way of saying one of the other things that I've been really thinking about is I listened to a podcast where someone was talking about the right response depends on the nature of your community and society and societal expectations and how they respond to things. And the way they described it was tight and loose. Some countries are very tight. They follow rules. You just need to tell them to do something and off they go and they do it. Other countries like New Zealand are loose. And so if you want them to do something, you need to come down like a ton of bricks and with complete clarity, no ambiguity. This is what we're doing, because if you don't, no one's going to follow the rules, right? So I think, you know, when we sit there and reflect on other experiences, one of the things we have to be really honest about is what's our starting point? Because if we're loose and we do something that's not consistent with a loose society, then it's not going to work, and vice versa. So I think, you know, there's just a lot of complexity in here, and in the heat of the moment when people are looking for answers, a lot of that gets lost in translation. But I will give you one answer in terms of what can we learn from Europe. I've spent some time in Europe a couple of years ago just traveling around looking at innovative human service delivery. And there are some tremendously dynamic and innovative models that we are going to have to be thinking about and looking to more systematically bring and roll out in Australia if we're going to give people the quality of care that they expect and manage that within now even tighter fiscal constraints.
That point about understanding society's expectations and kind of framework, it's such an interesting one, isn't it? And you think about Victoria with a second load of restrictions, and the psychological response is being quite different. So that's a really interesting kind of thing to or an overlay to have when we're thinking about an economic response. Michael, I might throw the final question, because we're running out of time, to you. As demand has collapsed in line with lost jobs, would modern monetary theory / quantitative easing enable a safety net without causing inflation?
Well, I remain a skeptic about modern monetary theory, but obviously the monetary authorities around the world have taken to more and more unconventional stances, including in Australia. So the central banks are more involved in bond markets than they have been, and possibly than they would like to have been, albeit they're all at pains to say, this is not monetizing the deficit. This is just us, by choice, stepping in to ease financial conditions at particular points in the yield curve. I remain a bit of a traditionalist, that ultimately it is an important discipline that when governments run deficits, that they go to the market and sell their bonds, because I think it's an important discipline ultimately on fiscal policy. Albeit, we've got abnormal times. I think the authorities are all doing their bit to adjust to that. But yeah, in a new steady state, I wouldn't see a strong case for departing from that principle, because I think it's held Australia in very good stead.
Well, look, that's all we have time for, I'm afraid. I'd like to thank our guests today, Michael Brennan, Melinda Cilento, and George Megalogenis. Thank you to all of those who have joined us at home and at their workspaces and asked such thoughtful questions. We have 3 more talks in the series, and bookings are now open on the library's website. So I look forward to seeing you next Friday. In the meantime, there's plenty for you to explore at the State Library online and on social media through Library in Your Lounge. Stay safe and well.